It's now my pleasure to introduce Rabbi Mark Diamond. Rabbi Mark Diamond is also a friend. It's nice to have friends on the podium with you, particularly when you have a subject like this. Mark is Executive Vice President of the Board of Rabbis of Southern California. And if you want to have a job description where you need to be an expert in conflict resolution, how about trying to direct 300 rabbis? He leads an organization with over 330 rabbis, and trying to get them in the same direction and agree on something is one of Mark's many skills. He also serves on the senior management team of the Jewish Federation of Greater Los Angeles. Before assuming this job, Mark served as rabbi of congregations in San Francisco, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and New York. So he's not just an organizational kind of guy. He's been a rabbi serving the people in congregations as well. As the board's executive vice president, he has really taken the board in new and creative and very innovative programs for both his colleagues and the community. Mark is a noted leader nationwide, and particularly here in Southern California, for his extensive leadership in the area of collaborative interfaith projects. He has served in a number of capacities and had a number of awards given to him for that activity. He is a good man, a man who, as you get to know him better, you see more and more kind of the depth of this deep wisdom he has. And you see the love that he has for God. You see the love that he has for his Jewishness. And you see his focused and passionate commitment to peace and reconciliation with those that see things very differently. Pleasure to introduce Rabbi Mark Diamond.
Michael, thank you for that warm and gracious introduction. So I'm sitting here on the stage thinking, why, dear God, did I ask to be last on this panel? I want to try to address some of the questions that were on the invitation and some that Michael was kind enough to share with me. And if I give you what we call in Hebrew Roshei Tevot kind of headlines, you'll understand because the hour is late and the time is short, and we can explore some of them later on, either in the Q&A or at the dinner table. First question was, is religion being used as a tool to control people? Yes. Okay. Sadly, yes. Throughout history, many people, many have used religion as a means of power and control. For example, to suppress human freedom and dignity. But the religious faith I know and love, and my understanding of my own Jewish tradition, empowers people to serve as partners with God in healing and redeeming our world. There's a wonderful phrase, Adam shutafo shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We and I sincerely believe that we are put on earth to serve as God's partners in healing and repairing and perfecting our world. Does religion have a place in modern society? Again, I answer yes. If I said no, I mean, well, I wouldn't have a job. Nor would any of these folks here, except maybe, well, that's true. Well, Saab, you'd still have a job, and so would Michael. Religion does have a place in the world today, and I think we need to rescue and redeem religion from those who give it a bad name. I know my friend Jihad talked about bad religion when my son, who's now 20, almost 23, when he was the precious age of 13, his favorite rock group was called Bad Religion. He actually once schlepped me to a concert. I don't recommend this for parents in the audience. And I don't know that there's bad religion. I know there's a lot of bad things done in the name of religion. And I think all of us have an obligation, whatever our faith tradition may be, to rescue and redeem religion from those who give it a bad name. The voices of violence, of hatred, of extremism, of intolerance tend to be much louder and much noisier than the voices of peace and love and mutual respect. All of us were asked to speak about religious radicalism within our own faith traditions, and I intend to do that. And I want to speak, actually would begin very briefly, going all the way back to the Torah, to the Bible, to the book of Numbers chapter 25. And since the hour is late, I know you all have memorized the Torah, and you know the story. It's the story of Pinchas, of Phinehas, who there is a bad incident, if you will, that happens in the Israelite camp. The children of Israel on the way to the land of Israel have, let's put it honestly here, the hour's late, an orgy with the Moabite women, okay? All right, the Israelite men begin to engage in illicit relations with the Moabite women. A plague breaks out among the people. To make matters worse, an Israelite prince by the name of Zimri takes a Midianite lover named Cosbi and into his tent in full view of Moses and all the people. Everybody starts crying. That's a good Jewish reaction when we don't know what to do. We scream and yell and cry. I mean, it's a terrible incident. There's a plague breaking out. Nobody knows what to do. Suddenly, without warning, Aaron, the high priest, his grandson Phinehas or Pinchas, takes matters into his own hands. He seizes his spear. He rushes into Zimri's tent. He kills both the Israelite and his Midianite lover. The plague is lifted. In a postscript to the narrative, God bestows the eternal Brit Shalom, the covenant of peace, upon Pinchas, upon Phinehas, for his zeal. Now, it's a very interesting story, and I would share with you very quickly my take on that. Later, the Torah is pretty clear that Pinchas did something that was great, okay? I disagree, okay? And I'm in good company, because later rabbinic authorities and the Talmud have two very different opinions about this act. Was this a great act that saved the day, or was this an act of unbridled and unwarranted religious zeal? And frankly, and it's interesting when Moses later on in the Torah is asked for God to appoint a successor because he's getting a bit tired, all right? It is not Pinchas, it is not the fiery zealot who is the one who is named Moses' successor. It is Joshua, who is called an inspired man in the Bible. And I read this whole incident and this Brit Shalom not as a reward for Pinchas the Zealot. I read it kind of as a warning, as a caution to religious radicals. Perhaps this Brit Shalom, this covenant of peace, was designed to send a message to Pinchas and to all would-be zealots, past, present, and future. Your fervor, your religious fervor, must be held in check by constant appraisal and reappraisal of the morality of your conduct. Your passion, your religious passion, must be tempered by a keen appreciation of the sacredness of each and every human life. Your zeal must be balanced by a critical mind and a caring heart. That's my understanding, at least, of that story. That's the first case in my mind of religious radicalism in the Jewish faith tradition. Fast forward to the present day, the two most tragic and most infamous examples of Jewish religious radicalism both took place in the state of Israel, in the land of Israel. Baruch Goldstein, who murdered 39 Muslim worshipers at the cave of Machpelah in Hebron in 1994. He was a follower of the really very extremist Rabbi Meir Kahane and his later outlawed Koch party. It was a terrible, brutal act and was and is condemned by every bona fide religious authority I know. Yigal Amir, who assassinated Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in 1995. And friends, if we ever think that a single act cannot change history, that act changed history. I firmly believe that that act tragically changed the course of the Middle East peace process forever. Okay, Amir was quoted afterwards as saying that he, quote, acted alone and on orders from God. All right, he acted alone on orders from God, and he was inspired by some rather extremist Israeli rabbis who had a concept of what's called in Hebrew the din rodef, that if somebody is pursuing you, you can turn around and kill them if they're trying to harm you. And he was convinced, led by some teachings, all right, that Yitzhak Rabin's peace process made him a rodef, a pursuer, and he was acting within Jewish law. In order, when he assassinated him, nothing could be more tragic or further from the truth. In preparing for tonight, Michael and I discussed the question, which I find fascinating: what allows people who have strongly held religious beliefs to, quote unquote, go bad? or maybe go rogue, in the words of one of our would-be presidential aspirants. Multiple factors. First, I see that people have often a very narrow and selective reading of their scriptural texts, elevating, for example, the holiness of land and purity of faith as a higher virtues than the holiness and sacredness of life. I believe, and when I study Jewish tradition, to love God, to demonstrate love of God, is to love God's creation. And the pinnacle of God's creation is humankind. And religious radicals often distort and pervert that core principle of religious faith. Secondly, we have to recognize that radical religious language can and often does lead to radical religious behavior. Words matter. Fiery sermons do have an effect on people. And when people hear teachings that incite them, some of them will act on those. Third, fear of the other, okay? And Brian, I think, alluded to this. I think the greatest fear we have, and that was part of your text tonight, was about confronting our fears, facing our fears. I think fear of the other is our most profound challenge in the world today. And on the same note, I would argue that we all know the wonderful phrase, it takes a village to raise a child. I would also argue that a village can destroy a child. And communal pressures, people often are searching for a community, and sometimes the communities they find are really bad communities, really dangerous communities. So how do I, as a rabbi, address these issues within Judaism and the Jewish community? Very briefly, just highlights. Number one, I am passionately committed to policing our own. I believe that too often when we have these kind of dialogues and discussions, and thank God it hasn't happened here tonight, I'll be up here as the rabbi and I'll say to my friend Jihad, oh, these are all the things that are bad about Islam. Or say to Brian, these are all things that are bad about Christianity. I think we have an obligation rather to look inward and look at our own radicals within our own respective faith communities. We have to remain vigilant about extremists and radicals within and without. Secondly, as leaders and followers, we have a sacred obligation to engage in what in my tradition is called cheshbon hanefesh, a continual inventory of self-assessment and reassessment. And third, we have to recognize that when it comes to religious faith, uncertainty is a greater principle and asset than certainty. Questions are more critical than answers. Anyone who says to me, I know exactly what God expects of me, makes me very, very uncomfortable and nervous. I prefer the traditional Jewish notion, which Elie Wiesel has written about so extensively and beautifully, of wrestling with God. I don't really know what God expects of me. Most of us live our lives not in black and white, but in the gray areas of life. And I'm not always sure what God expects of me. I try to figure out the answer, but it's not always clear. And anyone who says to me with absolute certainty, I know what God demands of me, makes me very nervous. A final comment. How have I experienced and dealt with religious extremism? First, I think we have an obligation as religious leaders to teach and preach the very same values within our community as we do outside the community. I frankly tire of so-called religious leaders who give one message within their own houses of worship and a very different message, often a softer message, if you will, when they speak in before audiences such as this. I think we have to teach and preach the very same values within and without. Secondly, we have to recognize that moral relativism is naive and dangerous, especially when it comes to religious radicalism. The notion that I still hear about a lot, that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, I think, frankly, is a bunch of baloney. There is evil in the world. There are people who want to do us harm. There are leaders who, in this world today, who seek to annihilate other nations, other races, other ethnic groups, and followers of other religious faiths. Some of these leaders are so-called and self-proclaimed religious figures. Others cloak themselves in religious garb. Our task, I think, is to preach and to teach the truest ideals and values of our respective faith traditions. And I will close with a beautiful comment by Israeli President Shimon Peres. As some of you know, he was in LA recently for 4 days. He says this over and over, and I love it, and this is my message to leave you with tonight. Pessimists and optimists both die the same way, but they lead their lives very differently. I would rather choose to be an optimist and to live my life believing that we're all God's children and we all have a task here on earth to perfect this world. Thank you very much.